Hello, and welcome back to our series on heaven, hell, salvation, and resurrection. Do you understand everything you know about that? I think after the first one, we've all agreed no, we probably don't. Um, Note my YouTube channel. You must have already found it. You're here. Please do share it with other folks, and maybe they'd be interested in hearing this as well. Our series here is a six-part series. Due to the extensive nature of this particular section, section 3, I've divided it into 3 mini videos. This is part A. What is hell? What are the words of hell used in the Bible? And some thoughts on that. And then there are 2 other shorter videos. I've done this because it just got to be too long, and I think it just helps everybody. So let's focus today, what is hell, and let's give some background on the origins of hell. The church counselors throughout the ages have upheld the doctrine of hell, and it's firmly rooted in our Christian belief. It's an idea that will not go away. U.S. News and World Report poll from not too long ago shows that more Americans believe in hell today than in the 50s, the 80s, and the early 90s, which surprised me. For every American who believes he's going to hell, there are 120 who believe they're going to heaven. We have a lot of optimism here in this country. The optimism stands in stark contrast, frankly, to Christ's words in Matthew 7:13 through 14, which says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." So how do we reconcile all this? Well, in the Bible, Jesus says more than anyone else about hell. And I've listed some of the verses here on the slide as well as in your handouts. According to some scholars, he refers to it as a literal place and describes it in graphic terms, including raging fires and the worm that doesn't die. And Christ says the unsaved will be, quote, thrown outside into the darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. C.S. Lewis has stated, "I have met no people who fully disbelieved in hell and also had a living and life-giving belief in heaven. The biblical teaching on both destinations stands or falls together." He also states, "If I had a choice, if Scripture were not so clear and conclusive, I would certainly not believe in hell. Trust me when I say I do not want to believe in it. But what I make myself want and what others want, the basis of my beliefs, then I'm a follower of myself and my culture, not a follower of Christ." Dorothy Sayers says that to forget or conceal where the doctrine of hell comes from is wrong. It's a conspiracy. It's not a medieval priestcraft for frightening people into giving money to the church. It's actually Christ's deliberate judgment on sin. We can't repudiate hell without altogether repudiating Christ. C.S. Lewis writes, "There's no doctrine I would more willingly remove from Christianity than this, but it has the full support of Scripture and especially of our Lord's own words." The more modern interpretation rejects the idea of physical torment and asserts that the torture of hell is mental anguish caused by separation from God. A recent survey of modern attitudes revealed that 53% of Americans embrace this perspective. Pope John Paul II declared that hell is not a punishment imposed externally by God, but is the natural consequence of the unrepentant sinner's choice to live apart from God. And then still others have rejected the doctrine of hell outright and believe everyone will be saved. We need to get something straight first and foremost. God and Satan are not equal opposites. Likewise, hell and heaven are not equal opposites. Just as God has no equal as a person, heaven has no equal as a place. Where do we get most of our ideas within our culture and society, and frankly, in biblical interpretation, is from the work of Dante. and specifically the part of his trilogy, the Divine Comedy, the part called the Inferno. And this particular painting, as well as the explanation, the chart here, are the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno. He depicts 9 concentric circles of torment located beneath the earth. Unfortunately, most of this, if not all of it, is not biblical at all. But that seems to be where we get a lot of our cultural interpretation, and not just of hell, but the persona of who the devil is as well. But that's for a later video. What are the origins of hell, and who was hell created for? I think those are some key questions we need to talk about. Mesopotamian civilizations from the 3rd to the 1st millennium BC, so 1,000 to 3,000 years BC, have a rich literature dealing with death and hell, much of it to impress upon the hearer the vast gulf separating the living from the dead and the fragility of the cosmic order on which the vitality and fertility depend. For Mesopotamian traditions, hell is described as a distant land of no return, a house of dust where the dead dwell without distinction of rank or merit, and a sealed fortress. The tombs and pyramids of the necropolises of ancient Egypt attest to an extraordinary concern for the state of the dead. The deceased needed both magical and moral power to be acquitted of offenses when appearing before their gods. Those who succeeded won immortality, and those who failed were devoured by a crocodile-headed monster or tormented by demons or worse. There is a suggestion, it's very rare, of eternal condemnation. Throughout the classical period in the Greek and Roman empires, we find that there was a profusion of eschatological teachings in which the underworld was increasingly infernalized, its hellish dimensions explored, and moral implications were exploited. Early depictions of the afterlife in ancient Greece depict an underworld realm called Hades. And there the listless spirits of the dead lingered in an underground twilight existence ruled by the god of the dead of the same name. Evildoers, suffered an even gloomier imprisonment on a deeper level called Tartarus. And in the Hebrew Bible, Sheol was a place of darkness, silence, and dust, to where the spirit descends at death. Sheol was a shadowy, silent pit where the souls of the dead lingered in minimal state of silent existence. Once in Sheol, the dead are cut off from their living kin and from the cultic relationship to God. However, God was there, and God retains his sovereignty over Sheol. And he searches out the evildoers who hide in its depths, preserving or delivering the just. And ultimately, the promise was to restore the dead to life. Similar concepts of hell are also included in Iranian and Zoroastrian eschatology, as well as Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. In short, just about everyone for the last 5,000 years believes in an afterlife destination like hell. This slide is about the words of hell. And in the Bible, they are words that are in Greek or in Hebrew or in Aramaic are translated into English as hell. But the words are actually in English. I've listed the English meaning of those words are actually slightly different. So we're going to kind of walk through this. The 4 main words used for the concept of hell or something like that are Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, and Tartaro. There are maybe other words and phrases that might illustrate something about hell, and sometimes are actually in your English Bible as hell, but the real words are eternal fire and or eternal punishment, outer darkness, lake of fire, and destruction. So let's take a look at each of these a little bit. Sheol is a Hebrew word used in the Old Testament. Sheol is translated grave also in the English Bible, or in English translations. And it is the underworld, the grave. It sometimes can denote a hell, but most of all, what it means is the abode for the dead. The Old Testament speaks of it as the abode of the shades, shades meaning the limp or the powerless ones. Such a region was thought to be located under the earth. Some have suggested the underworld really is the best translation. And if you see in the lower left corner of your slide, there is a depiction of how the ancients viewed the world. And Sheol was literally beneath the actual land or earth, if you would call it, and the entire universe was depicted as a dome, if you will. In Sheol, the weary find rest. It's not beyond the reach of God's presence and power. Many times in the Old Testament, it is spoken of as a relief, as a place of rest, because of the fact that living and life in this world is weary and hard work. The Old Testament nowhere suggests that it's a place of torment for the wicked. Rather, it's the general abode or resting place of all the dead. There is not a distinction between the final destiny of the good and the evil. They all go to the grave, to the world below, the world of Sheol. The concept of Sheol is not exclusive compared to other ancient religions. It's the fate of all who walk the earth. And it was not until the time of post-canonical Jewish literature, that means early 1st century or maybe 1st century BC, that writings were developed, that distinctions were made between the final destinies of the righteous and the unrighteous. It's clear, though, that throughout it all in Jewish thought, as reflected through the whole Old Testament, a belief in a future and continued existence beyond death, however shadowy and indefinite and whatever the concept, it was very clear that that is what they believed. All scholars believe that there is no punishment in the afterlife according to the Hebrew Bible. And Jesus never changed this doctrine. I apologize. I should have switched slides, so I'll let this up for a second. I stated everything that was on this, but I should have had that in front of you. We'll give you a minute. All right, well, let's move on to the next word, which is Hades. It is used in the New Testament, and it is a Greek word, and it has its origins in Greek mythology about the 8th century BC, when it was initially denoted as the god of the underworld, and over time it became recognized more as a place than a specific god. Hades is not a prototype evil character like Satan. He's never been described as evil or malicious, but kind of gloomy and depressed. This is also not to say he's a good guy, but anyway. Perhaps what many people think, Hades is not hell, and it's never been thought of that way, at least for the most part. Hades is a place where everyone will go after death. From there, one's final destination can be reached, whether it be Tartarus, which is more similar to the popular concept of hell, or the Elysian Fields, again, more similar to the popular concept of heaven, based upon what they have done in this life. There's all these descriptions of Hades and in the Elysian fields and how that's separated and all this kind of stuff. Um, the gates of Hades, which is quoted also in the New Testament, is just the same thing as Hades, and it is the realm of the dead. It designated in general the place or the state of the dead, the grave, or death itself. Nothing more than the place of the dead, so to speak. Over time and in various cultures, Hades would lose its place in mythology and just become associated as simply the repository of lost souls or just the realm of the dead. Kind of how Sheol is now seen in ancient Judaism. Hades became the gloomy, neutral, almost boring place that lacked both the torments of hell and the joys of heaven, and was treated likewise as just a synonym of death. I forgot to change the slide again. Here you go. A few more. I just said everything that was there. The Greek word Gehenna is another interesting word because there's a development in the understanding or the meaning of this term over time. In general, it signifies the place of torment. It's a Greek word, Gehenna, which is a transliteration from the Aramaic word Gehenna also. And the Aramaic word is a direct translation of the Hebrew term Gehenna, which means the valley of the sons of Hinnom. So when Jesus speaks about Gehenna, he is literally saying the valley of Hinnom. And that is what the people heard when he said that word. And so Gehenna, during this time, during Christ's time, does not yet indicate a place of future punishment, but a place of real world death. So what's the background of this? This Valley of Hinnom, south of Jerusalem, is where filth and dead animals of the city were cast out and burned. It was kind of a fit symbol of the wicked and their destruction. In addition, the same valley referred to a time during the reigns of Israel's kings of Judah, King Ahaz and King Manasseh, where they adopted the practices of other pagan religions, and they allowed the sacrifice of their children to the god of Molech. As punishment for this, Jeremiah, the prophet, proclaimed that in the future this valley would be called the Valley of Slaughter, since many would be slain there, and for lack of room elsewhere, the dead would be buried in Tophet. In later Jewish thought, the name of this place and the infamy and horror became associated with the growing belief in the existence of a place where the wicked would be punished for eternity. And so the image of Gehenna as the placement and punishment of the wicked is used in later Jewish writings where it had strong associations with darkness and burning fire. And you need to understand that if in fact it became a dump, which in the New Testament, it is supposed, and archaeologically digs have found that it is in fact was a dump during that time, and it's where as dead animals and people and things were buried, as we know in landfills. If you don't capture the methane that comes off of it like we do in our modern landfills, the methane indeed can catch fire and will burn. And so that is why this picture is used in the Gospels, this to characterize a place of unquenchable fire. As a valley or a pit, if you are sentenced to death and your relatives do not claim your body to be buried, you winds up going there. And so this is the picture, if you will, that the gospel writers were trying to put in the minds of the believers to explain the understanding of the place of punishment for sinners, and ultimately what will become known as the lake of fire in the writings of Revelation, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. The Greek verb tartaros signifies the infernal region, and the only appearance of this particular Greek word, which is also translated to hell in English, it means consigning to Tartarus. And it was, again, an import of a Greek mythology term, which is the lowest part of the underworld, a place of punishment, and was distinct from Hades, and it consisted of fire and punishment and torment for those who wound up within its gates. Tartarus is mentioned throughout ancient literature, independent from Greek mythology. And like I said, it is only used once in 2 Peter, and he specifically says that this is the region to which rebellious angels were consigned. And it only applies to the immediate sphere of punishment for fallen angels. Another word that gets talked about is eternal fire or eternal punishment. And the key question that we're going to talk about in the next video is the fire a flame that lasts for eternity, or is the punishment of being sent to the fire an eternity of suffering and torment? So that's the key we're going to get to. And Edward Fudge correctly illustrates in his book, The Fire That Consumes, the adjective eternal modifies the fire and not the element or item that gets cast into the fire. So just because Jesus throws something into the eternal fire doesn't mean that that entity will burn for an eternity within the fire itself. The expression eternal fire also has concepts familiar with God within the Old Testament. So God as fire. For example, God was in Exodus, God goes before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to lead them. And in Exodus 24, to the eyes of the sons of Israel, the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop. In Exodus 3, Moses describes seeing God as a burning bush. And so these are just a fraction of the examples from the Old Testament that illustrate God as a fire and an eternal fire. And the question is that when the New Testament authors write about eternal fire, are those references suggesting the fire of God or the eternal fire of punishment? And if we go back and look at it, which we're not going to take the time to do today, there could be some question on that. And it's also where the author of Hebrews gets the idea that God is a consuming fire. So the question is, how do we interpret this? Do we interpret the words eternal fire or eternal punishment as hell? And there's no real designation that the punishment is eternal. It's always the fire that is eternal. So we need to talk about this a little bit more. Let's move on to the outer darkness. In Matthew chapter 8, Jesus heals the centurion's servant and credits him with an amazing faith. And in verses 11 through 12, he says, I tell you, many will come from the east and west and will eat with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of that kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, the outer means outer and the darkness means darkness. And the question is, what is this really? What's the understanding here? And it's a place or a region which is dark and removed, presumably from the abode of the righteousness. There's a question whether or not is the abode also of evil spirits and devils. There's a question there. The point is they're thrown outside of where the righteous people are. And that's not necessarily a straightforward understanding of hell per se. It just means they are separated. It could mean that it means something similar to Tartarus, but that's a question. The Hebrew word harak means to grate the teeth on and you're grinding your teeth. And it usually denotes rage or sorrow. And there's two types of people that gnash the teeth. One are enemies. Every time we look up gnashing of the teeth, it's always done by the enemies of the people of God. And then those that are weeping, those that realize that what they have done is wrong, and they are now weeping that they are outside and shut out of the kingdom. This passage is refused to the Jewish people who will be excluded later on from the kingdom of God. And there'll be extreme sadness and anger and upsetness because they have lost out on something they assumed they'd be automatic, quote, members of. Let's go on to the lake of fire. It's mentioned only in Revelations 19:20, and it's the final place of eternal punishment or destination for all unrepentant rebels, both angelic and human. It may or may not exist currently, as it might not be in use yet. It's perhaps the single most commonly used phrase that many use to demonstrate hell's reality, next to the Gehenna passages in the Bible. In order to assess the identity and function of the lake, the interpreter, us, we need to evaluate what ultimately gets thrown into the lake and see how it performs within this fire. Overall, God throws 5 entities into the lake of fire: the beast, the false prophet, Satan, death, and Hades. All right, those are the folks, and I'm not going to go into a Revelation explanation of exactly what all that means. You can listen to my Revelation videos on my YouTube channel. And in addition, those names not currently in the book of life. So it appears that the lake of fire is a destructive force rather than a place of unending torture. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more next week, or next video, I should say. Finally, the last word that's used that most people assumes hell is really the language of destruction. And in 2 Thessalonians 1:9, Paul says, those who do not know God, will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord, from the glory of his might. And perpetual means eternal or everlasting, and destruction means destruction. The state of utter ruin or destruction. People who are sent for destruction are not really they're allowed to continue on their own choice, on their own path of ruin, but there's a sense that there's no turning back. It's described as eternal. So those folks that are headed in that direction, there seems to be a sense that they will choose never to turn back. The destruction is sudden. There's lots of warnings about the way of destruction, and that God keeps his people from destruction, and that there will be no destruction in the world to come. To read hell into this passage is really reading something that's not there. And if it were, you would assume that whatever biblical author, when he mentions destruction, death, or die, that they fundamentally intend to denote hell. But Paul never even once mentions hell. He never uses Gehenna, Tartarus, and he uses Hades only once, and that's actually disputed. So this verse, therefore, essentially supports the annihilist viewpoint rather than the eternal torment viewpoint. And we'll have to talk about this. So destruction is a choice of a path that someone is taking. So what do I have to do? This belief in hell has been around for over 5,000 years. There are many words translated as hell in our Bibles that do not actually mean hell and may represent pagan understandings that have creeped into our culture and, unfortunately, our biblical interpretation. We need to take care how we understand and how we teach passages related to this subject. There are 2 more videos on this topic. B, does hell exist, and what are the church's and scholars' current beliefs about hell? And the final one, the mystery of evil, and who is Hasatan, or the devil? There's a wonderful quote about running through hell, just stay. And it's from C.S. Lewis, where he said, if you find yourself going through hell, keep on walking, don't stop. I hope you join me for the next 2 videos. God bless you. Take care.